As you might be able to guess from the neon sign behind me and from the loud music all around me, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. So welcome back to the channel. I'm currently at the beating heart of Nashville, which is Broadway. It's very, very hectic and chaotic. My first impression of Broadway is it feels like a music version of Vegas. There's a lot of like party buses and people like cycling and drinking beer, and girls on these trucks like dancing and doing like all sorts of other stuff. I drove yesterday from where I'm staying in Alexandria. I stopped by the Devil's Bathtub, which is like a short, like 1.5 to 2 hour round trip hike. You get to see like a really beautiful sinkhole and also a bathtub, because it's kind of like the shape of a bathtub. Super hot that day, and when I arrived, I was like drenched in sweat, and I just couldn't wait to cool off and go for a swim in the sinkhole. Then I worked a little bit further up, and then eventually found the bathtub, and then you just kind of step in, and it's quite deep actually. I don't know if it gets to like 15-20 feet deep. Next morning, i.e. this morning, had breakfast at the Broken Egg Cafe. So I know I only just had a little bit of breakfast, but I'm walking towards the Hattie B's to try the world famous hot chicken. So there's the Princess hot chicken, which I understand is supposed to be where it originated from, like where it started. And then there's Hattie's B, which came shortly after that, and it's known for making it world famous, or it's kind of taking it to the next step. There's a few places I want to visit. I think there's the Ryman Auditorium, I think that's what it's called. There's the Hatch Print Shop. So I've got a ticket to the listening room for a happy hour. So I want to go there and get a drink and enjoy some of the live music. There's loads of other options, but the ones that I had researched prior to coming here was the Nudies Honky Tonk, and also Robert's World, or Robert's Western World, I think is what it's called. Tomorrow, there's a couple of waterfalls I want to visit somewhat nearby, like an hour or 2 hours drive. Cummins waterfall, and also the Ozone waterfall, which looks really, really cool because you can hike up, and there's a really nice spot, I think, where you can get like above the waterfall. On my final day, I'm going to end my excursion at the Grandfather Mountain. It can be quite treacherous apparently. There's a lot of ladders, and if you're afraid of heights, then you shouldn't really do it, but I'm still going to give it a go. I think the reward will be worth the effort and the risk on my life. Right, so I went to visit the Hot Prince's Chicken, which is inside the food assembly hall. To be honest with you, I know it probably feels a bit superficial for me to say, but it feels very small and wasn't that busy, and compared to Hattie's B's, this place feels a lot more legit and a lot more busy. So I've decided to try the world famous hot chicken here at Hattie's B's instead of Prince's Chicken. Alright, so here it is, guys. Alright, so I got the 3 chicken tenders, and there's different spice levels. Apparently the average spice level here is quite high, so given that I already can't handle spice that well, I went for a mild one. It's nice. I think I've chosen the right spice level. So it's just now been a couple of hours since we finished the world famous Nashville's hot chicken. Got some souvenirs at the Country Music Hall of Fame, I think that's what it's called. And I've just arrived. Behind me, the listening room. And this is the crowd. And behind me, I think that's the our entertainment for happy hour. So we're now back in Broadway. Just been scoping out a few of the different honky tonks. I think I'm going to go to Robert's Western World. I think it's probably got the best atmosphere in my opinion. So I think I've just arrived. It's just right behind me there. Robert's Western World. Right, let's go get a seat. That's going to be a wrap. So yeah, that's it of my experience of Nashville, Tennessee. Tomorrow we're gonna go back to nature. Good night, guys. Right, good morning, guys. It's now the very next day. Today, essentially, the plan is to drive to Linville. On the way to Linville, which is very, very close to the Grandfather Mountain, which I'm going to hike tomorrow morning. There's a couple of pretty cool waterfalls that I wanted to check out. First is the Cummins State waterfall, which is what I'm doing now. And then the second is the Ozone waterfall. You can go to the base of the waterfall and that's where you can swim inside it and stuff. But you have to walk through or wade through a river that's like knee deep. And I didn't really want to do that in my hiking boots. And you know, ideally you should have some water shoes and things like that. So instead you can just hike to like an overlook, and that's what I'm going to do now. Been told it's like a 30-minute round trip hike, so it's just very, very short and easy. Right, so just made it to the waterfall overlook. Just get onto this platform and then you can see down there, that's Cummins waterfall. A little bit of a shame that I'm not going to be down there, but I'm going to see Ozone Falls, and I've got higher hopes for that. Let's see the Ozone Falls. Hopefully, should be a bit more interactive. Right, waterfall number 2. Just drove another hour, and then just after like a 10-minute hike, it's not really a hike, it's very, very close to where you park. Then there is well, it's actually not higher than I thought. The Ozone waterfall. So when I first parked the car, I actually went to the top of that waterfall there, just to be like on top of the waterfall. And then I saw some people down here, so I was like, yeah, of course I want to get down and go for a swim and see what the water's like. Right, good morning, guys. I have just arrived at the Black Rock parking area for Grandfather Mountain. It feels a bit more like a national park in terms of when you get in, there's like a booth. I had to buy a permit, which is like $30 odd. So it's also similar price to entering like a national park here. And then we start pretty much like a hiking here, which is the way to the mile-high swinging bridge. We'll start on the Grandfather Trail. There'll be like ladders and things like that to climb, and it can get quite sketchy. Right, so just after about a short 10-15 minute hike, we arrived at the upper Grandfather car parking area. So the parking lot is behind me. There's a top shop, and I think there in the distance, that's the mile-high swinging bridge. And as you can see from the sign, this should be quite a strenuous hike. So yeah, just gonna crack on with this hike, and as always, I'll keep you updated. So it's now been about 45 minutes now into my hike. There were some parts where it was quite steep and slippery, and that's why there was like a cable which you use to help you get up. We crossed through our first ladder, and I think this is where the ladders begin now. I'm just taking another break before the next ladder. I think there's like 7 or 8 ladders up to McRae Peak. I'm just gonna make that my end destination rather than going all the way to Callaway Peak. Gonna keep plowing on to McRae Peak. Right, so I just finished climbing up my final ladder up to McRae Peak, which is just there. I've not actually got to the peak yet. There's quite a few people here, so I decided to wait until they passed. Let's summit McRae Peak together.
Darn right it's summit.
Hey, what do you say?
You're darn right it's McRae Peak.
Wow. So this is the lowest of the 3 peaks, is it? Because there's Callaway and Attic Window as well.
I believe Callaway might be the highest. From them they said that this is the best views. Attic Window's worth going, but he's the expert right here, so he's got the intel.
This is the best one by far. So.
This is the best one by far?
Yeah.
I think so too. Yeah, I think I might stay here actually.
Oh yeah, I know. I'm gonna take at least a good time here and enjoy these views.
All right, cool. Yeah, views are pretty good here, 360 degrees. All right guys, so here we are at the summit of McRae Peak. I don't think this is the tallest peak of the 3 peaks here at Grandfather Mountain. I think Callaway Peak's the highest, at probably about maybe 6,000 feet or so. But nonetheless, from what the other hikers have been telling me, this seems like the peak with the best views. Right, so we're coming into week 7 after a couple of weeks of profit after the first horrendous 4 weeks that we had at the beginning of the trip. Feeling pretty good right now that we're back on the mend, and definitely looking to build some stacks and start winning some decent money. Right, so without further ado, let's dive into the very first interesting hand from my session last Friday. Right, so in this hand, the $10 straddle is on, and the action folds to the low jack, who opens for $30. The action is now on the hijack, who makes the call before the action then folds to the button, who decides to put in a 3-bet to $100. The action is now on me in the small blind, and I look down at pocket kings. Effective stacks with me and the button is about $700. We got villain covered as we have about $1,000 in our stack. I think cold 4 betting should be the higher frequency play here. I don't think I ever really like flatting so much in these spots, especially when we're out of position. I definitely lean more towards taking the initiative and the betting lead, and if we are going to play, then I do want to come in for a cold 4 bet. So that's what I decided to do in this instance. I decided to put in the cold 4 bet to $250. The action's now on the low jack, who goes into the tank before releasing his cards. The hijack folds, and now the action's back on the button 3-better, who doesn't actually take too long before jamming the rest of his stack in, and I, of course, snap call. So we're now off to see all 5 cards, and the flop comes Queen, Jack, 9. At the turn then comes an offsuit King, which is now obviously great, but then the river unfortunately comes an offsuit Jack, which now brings 5 to a straight. So not only are we counterfeited, we now lose to any ace. And it seems like we were actually behind all along, because the villain tabled pocket aces for a rivered straight, even though he had us beat pre-flop anyway. So yeah, not a great start to the session, but yeah, the hand pretty much plays itself.
You were behind after the turn, no question.
I was fucking right behind. He had a king or queen for sure.
7, 20. Right, so in this hand we have another $10 straddle, and the action folds to me in early position, and I look down at Queen, Jack of clubs. So I decide to make the standard open to $30. The action then folds to the hijack, who makes the call, and then continues folding all the way to the big blind, who also decides to call, and the straddler also decides to call. So we are now going 4 ways to the flop, which comes Queen, 4, Deuce, Rainbow. So all in all, a pretty decent flop for our hand. Action quickly checks to me, and I think in this spot we should be c-betting at a very high frequency. In terms of sizing, given that we are still multi-way and we have ourselves a very dry board, I think I like going for a small sizing here. I don't think we ever really need to be betting too big here with all of our bluffs and all of our value. So in this case, I decided to put out a small c-bet of just $40, so a quarter pot bet. The hijack folds, the big blind calls, and the straddler also decides to call. We are now going 3 ways to the turn, which comes an offsuit 5. Big blind checks, straddler checks, and the action's on me. In this spot, I think we do want to go for a double barrel here. And in terms of sizing, I think we want to ask ourselves if we want to be going for 2 or 3 streets of value here. I'm not sure if Queen Jack is good enough for 3 streets here. I think it'd be kind of close, as I think there should be quite a lot of pair plus straight draws out there.
And if there are some Queen X, I think they may struggle to call 3 streets unless they had like King Queen plus. So I don't think Queen Jack has quite enough value to be triple barreling here for value. So in my mind, I think I've decided to just go for 2 streets of value. And in that case, I want to size up the turn rather than continuing for like another like third pot type size bet. So therefore, in this case, I did decide to size up here and bet $150. The big blind goes into the tank before eventually deciding to make the call, and the straddler folds. So we are now heads up going to the river card, and I think the only river cards I don't want to see would probably be the kind of cards that complete gut shots or kind of straight draws that are available. So on the river card, the dealer puts out an offsuit ace. So I think the only other hand that would beat us now would be a hand like ace 5, that kind of called flop for like the gut shot, and then paired up on the turn, and has now rivered a 2 pair. The action is now on the big blind who's in the tank, and while he's in the tank, I'm just trying to decide whether or not I would be calling any river bets here. While this card may hit villain's range at some frequency, it also hits our range as well, as we could also quite easily have ace 5 suited ourselves, or even hands such as ace queen. So I think because of this, it should lessen the frequency at which our opponent would be bluffing here, as we do have some strong value hands that arrive at the river here. But after being in the tank for a little while, villain does eventually decide to check. The action's now on me. When there's no more value to be had, I think this hand now just defaults to a check, and villain rolls over 5-6 of diamonds for just a flopped middle pair. We table our hand for the winner, and we get to drag in the first pot of our session. Right, so in this next hand, the action folds to me in middle position, and I look down at pocket deuces. So I decide to open to $15 as there's no straddle on in this hand. The action then folds to the cutoff who makes the call, and only the big blind behind makes the call. So we are now going 3 ways to the flop, which comes queen, ace, 3, rainbow. Action checks to me, and I think in this spot it's obviously going to be quite tough for us to have the best hand here. However, given that we are the pre-flop aggressor on an ace high board, more likely than not we should have the range advantage here, and therefore I decide to continue the aggression and go for a c-bet as a bluff. So I decide to put out a small c-bet of just $15. The cutoff then makes the call, and the big blind folds. So we are now going heads up to the turn, which now comes the 4 of clubs, which now brings in the backdoor flush draw and also gives us a gut shot to the backdoor straight. The action's on me, and I think this is now the most crucial decision point in the hand, as I think there should only really be 2 ways to play this hand. The first option is we could just check and give up, or the second option is that we can continue our story that we have a strong hand and therefore continue bluffing. And I think what's important here is that I think if we do continue to bluff on the turn, then we need to continue bluffing on the river. Now, I'm not one for using solvers, but I do know that in these spots, under pairs are generally rated as pretty good candidates to bluff on ace high boards. So given that the first option is pretty boring, and if that was the case, it obviously wouldn't make the vlog, I did decide to choose the more aggressive route and continue betting. I think if we do continue betting, I definitely want to continue sizing up here. We have a lot of very strong hands here, like aces up and ace queen and sets and the like. So in this case, I decided to bump it up and bet $45. Villain in the cutoff then just thinks for a little while before making the call, which is obviously not that great for us. As soon as villain called on the turn, in my mind, I was going to be bombing pretty much all river cards here, as I think all of our sets are 2 pairs, and even our bluffs, like where we have like jack 10 of like clubs for like the straight and backdoor flush, and also our small pocket pairs such as the one that we have right now. I think our entire range of bluffs and value, we want to be bombing pretty much all rivers here. So we are now off to the river card, and on the river the dealer puts out an offsuit deuce. So it's quite a ridiculous card. Obviously nice that we've improved on the river, but not that we needed it to be betting on the river here. So right now I'm just in the tank. I'm just calculating what the pot is to decide how much I'm going to bet. I eventually decided to put out an over bet of $190. And after thinking it through for a little while, villain pretty quickly decides to make the call. So I table my hand, and I don't think anyone would have ever expected to see the hand that I was rolling over. And villain then sees the bad news, taps the table, and he's like, nice hand. And he actually showed me that he had ace 4 offsuit for a turned aces up. Pretty sick run out for him, obviously. I think the only criticism I think I'd have of the way I played my hand is maybe I should have gone for a much larger overbet on the river, maybe something like $250 or so. So yeah, lucky river card for me, and nice hand.
That's rough, man.
Thanks. Right, so in this next hand, there is a limp from early and middle position before the action now folds to the hijack, who decides to bump it up to $25. I am then next to act in the cutoff, and I look down at ace-6 of hearts. So I decide to make the call. The action folds to the small blind, who also decides to make the call, and both the early and middle position limpers also decide to call. We are now going 5 ways to the flop, which comes ace-deuce-8 with 1 heart. So we flop ourselves top pair with a backdoor nut flush draw. The action quickly checks to the pre-flop aggressor, who's the player in the hijack, who decides to continue for a small c-bet of just $40. I think the most standard play here is to continue with just a call here, especially given that we are still like 5 ways here on the flop. So that's what I decide to do. I decide to continue with a flat call. The small blind folds, the early and middle position player also decides to fold. So we are now going heads up to the turn. And on the turn, the dealer puts out the queen of hearts, which now brings in the backdoor flush draw. The villain in the hijack now decides to continue betting, and he decides to fire out a second shell of $75. I think the standard play here would be just to continue calling, as more often than not, villain should have the stronger ace-x hands in the spot. And given that he has decided to double barrel, I think he should pretty much always have the best hand here. So I think we have a very easy decision here, which is just a call. So that's what I decide to do. I decide to continue with a flat call. We are now off to the river card here, and I'm actually looking for some help. The dealer puts out an offsuit deuce, which now renders the kicker of most ace-x hands except ace-king useless now, as there is a queen on board. So I think I have mixed feelings about this river card, as I think the positive is that if villain did have a hand like ace-jack or ace-10 or ace-9, then we are now obviously chopping with all these hands. But if villain did have a hand like ace-king, then I'm thinking it's going to be pretty hard for us to get away from any river bets here. As I'm kind of thinking about how I'm feeling about this river card, villain does decide to continue firing for a third shell, but he does choose a relatively small sizing of just $100. The action's on me. Yeah, really good sizing. I don't think I see ourselves folding here. I don't think our hand's going to be good in the sense that we're going to be winning the hand outright. I think villain should pretty much always have an ace here. The only question is, does he ever have ace-king? I don't think there's any other way to play this hand other than to continue with just a call here. I don't think we really have much of a decision here. I decide to make the side call here, just kind of hoping to chop the hand, but unfortunately villain tables ace-king offsuit for aces up with the king kicker. So unfortunately, we're going to be losing this hand.
When you call out, like one of you guys had.
Right, so in this next hand, the $10 shuttle is on, and we see a limp from under the gun and also from the low jack. The action then folds to me in the hijack, and I look down at jack 9 of diamonds. So I decide to put in the raise to $40. The action then folds to the small blind, who makes the call, and both the under the gun and low jack limper also decides to make the call. So we are now going 4 ways to the flop, which comes 9, 6, 5 with 2 spades and 1 heart. So the action's on me, and I think in this spot, although we do have top pair, this is a very wet and dynamic board. Not necessarily one that we want to be bloating the pot with, given that we have a hand that can't really improve and we are still multi-way. So in this spot, I'd also decide to check back. So we are now still 4 ways going to the turn, which now comes the 9 of hearts, which gives us top trips, but which now also brings in a second flush draw. The action, just like on the flop, also checks all the way to me. So I think we do want to go for a delay c-bet. And I think in terms of sizing, given that there are now 2 flush draws on board, I think we'll want to go for a larger sizing to kind of compensate for the value that we didn't go for on the flop. So I think in terms of sizing, I think we want to go for an over half pot type sizing. We're looking at the size of the pot. I decided to fire a bet of $100. The small blind folds, but the under the gun player decides to make the call, and the low jack also decides to call. So we are now off to the river card. The dealer puts out the 3 of spades. Obviously not the ideal river card here, as it does now complete one of the 2 flush draws. The under the gun player decides to check, which is good news. However, the player in the low jack now decides to go into the tank, and after a little while, he does decide to fire out a bet, but he decides to bet quite small of just $140. So in my mind, I think even if I had a hand hand like an overpair or just like a one pair type hand, I think I'll be more inclined to be looking villain up in this spot. As I think for most players, if they were to be going for value, I think they would be going for a much larger sizing. So given that we do have a hand as strong as trips, I think this should be pretty much a no-brainer call. I think the only concern we'd have here if we do decide to call is that I think our hand is now pretty capped, and it would open ourselves up to be maybe getting bluffed by the player in the under the gun position. So I don't take too long before making the call. The under the gun player decides to fold. Fortunately for us, villain in the low jack tabled Queen 8 of hearts for a missed backdoor flush draw. Things worked out pretty well for us in this hand, and we're going to be taking down this pot.
Appreciate making it obvious. Yeah.
Before we begin the next hand, I just want to note that I've actually hiked back down to the upper car park because it got super crowded up there. And I didn't think the people were going to appreciate me discussing poker hands when everyone's there trying to enjoy the scenery. Anyhow, so let's continue with the next hand. In this hand, the action falls to the low jack, who decides to limp in. The high jack next to him also decides to limp. And then I look down in the cutoff with ace 4 of spades. So I decide to raise to $25. The action then folds all the way to the big blind, who now decides to put in a 3-bet. And he decides to re-raise to $80. The action folds back to the hijack, who goes into the tank before he then decides to cold call the big blind's 3-bet of $80. The action's on me, and given that both of these players have at least $600 effective in their stack, and that I don't think the big blind is getting out of line too often here, I decide to also continue with a flat call. We are now 3 ways going to the flop, which comes amazing. It comes ace 3 6 with 2 spades. So we flop ourselves top pair with the nut flush draw. Action's on the big blind, and he decides to put out a C-bet. I think he bet maybe like about $100. The action's now on the hijack, who doesn't really like the flop too much and decides to fold his cards. And the action's now back on me. In this scenario, of course, we're going to be seeing both turn and river. The question is just how. Villain's only got like $500 left in his stack or so. So facing a bet of like just over $100, I think it should just be a pretty easy jam. I decided to put villain in for the rest of his stack for about $500-600, and villain snap calls. So as soon as villain calls, I table my hand just to let him know what he's up against. And on the turn, we get help immediately with an offsuit 4, and the river comes another spade. So we river the nuts. And villain actually showed us that he had ace queen offsuit. So indeed, we actually did need some help on the turn or river to take down this pot.
That sucks, because I had you.
You did.
Like when I called. Well, that's all my money for the week. Goodbye, folks.
In this hand, the $10 straddle is on again, and the action folds all the way to the hijack, who is a new player who joined the table. And he decides to limp in for $10. The cutoff then folds, and then I look down on the button with 10-8 of hearts. So I decide to isolate this late position limper and raise to $50. The action then folds all the way back around to the hijack limper, who decides to make the call. So we are now going heads up to the flop. The flop comes 8, 9, deuce, all spades. The hijack decides to check to me. I think in this spot, I don't mind going either way here between checking and betting. A hand like 10-8 of hearts on this flop texture would definitely benefit from some protection. The main challenge with our hand is navigating future streets on turn and river. After taking a little bit of time just to decide what I want to do, eventually I did decide to continue for a small C-bet of $25. Villain in the hijack then doesn't think for too long before making the call. We are now off to a turn card, and on the turn the dealer brings the king of diamonds. The hijack quickly checks to me for a second time, and in this spot again I think we can go either way here. I think if we do decide to bet twice, then we're going to be checking pretty much all rivers unless we improve, and if we do decide to check, then we could maybe induce some bluffs on the river by some missed flush draws. So on this occasion I decided to check back and play a river card. On the river, the dealer puts out the 6 of spades, which now puts 4 to a flush. Villain now takes a bit of a pause to go into the tank before eventually deciding to check for a third time. So the action's on me, and now we have a decision. So I'm just in the tank here, and I'm just trying to decide how often our pair of 8s is good here. I think villain could quite easily have a smaller pocket pair in his hand with a spade. In addition to that, I think he can also have some 9x hands. So those are the hands that we lose to. We also beat smaller pocket pairs without a spade. However, I think on balance, more often than not, our hands shouldn't be good here. Because of this, I'm in the tank and I'm having thoughts of bluffing. So the only hands that we're trying to bluff out here are his 9x and king
against type hands, and to be honest with you, I'm not sure how comfortable villain would be calling off a river bet if he did have a hand like pocket fours or fives with the spade. As from my perspective, given the way that I've played my hand, I could quite easily also have a high card spade in my hand for a higher flush. After taking a little bit of time just to decide what bet sizing I want to choose, I decided to put out a bet of $75. Villain then doesn't take for too long, unfortunately, before making the call. Villain tables his hand. Although I'm not surprised to see that he has me beat, I am, however, very surprised to see that Villain tabled ace-king offsuit with the king of spades. So yeah, Villain played this hand very, very passively, and so we are going to be losing this pot.
He made money here, right? I came to him to do a living.
In this hand, the action folds to me in middle position, and I look down at ace-10 of clubs. So I decide to open to $15. The action then folds to a late position player, and he decides to make the call. The action then continues folding all the way to the big blind, who decides to put in a 3-bet, and he decides to squeeze to just $50. The big blind starts his hand with about $1,000, and the player in late position has about $500. Both of these players are actually new on this table. My perception of the late position player is that he's a pretty loose player. However, the player in the big blind is quite a tight ABC type player. So facing the squeeze, I'm pretty certain that we don't have the best hand here. But given that we're playing over 200 bigs deep and we have position, this hand is a no-brainer call. I decide to continue with a flat call, and the late position player also decides to call. We are now going 3 ways to the flop, which comes pretty good. It comes 6, 7, 10 with 1 club. We flop ourselves top pair with a backdoor nut flush draw. The action's on the big blind here, and I think depending on what the big blind decides to do, would define his hand, in my view, pretty clearly. I think the big blind would be betting all of his overpairs and checking all of his ace highs. At least that's my perception. After the big blind just takes a little bit of time just to decide what to do, he eventually decides to play a check. So this obviously now makes me feel like I have the best hand. The decision for me now is, do we bet or do we check? I think if we were heads up against the big blind, I would be putting in a small bet at quite a high frequency. But given that the player behind me is someone who I perceive to be quite loose and likes to put bets in with weak to medium strength type hands, I decide to disguise the strength of my hand by playing a check and also let Villain in late position do the betting for me. The action is now on the late position player, who doesn't disappoint, and he decides to put in a bet. He decides to bet $130. The action's on the big blind, who doesn't think for too long before making the quick fold, and the action's now back on us. I think in this spot, I want to continue the story that I have a somewhat of a marginal hand. I want to continue letting Villain believe that he has the best hand with his 1-pair type holdings, which in my view is probably the most likely type of hands that he's likely to have. So in order to continue disguising the strength of our hand, I decide to just continue with a flat call. So we're now heads up to the turn card, and on the turn the dealer puts out the 5 of spades. I continue to check twice, and the action is now back on Villain in late position, and after taking a little bit of time just to decide what to do, Villain eventually decides to jam the rest of his stack in for like $400 odd, and I of course snap call. So we're now off to see the river card, and on the river the dealer puts out an offsuit 6, and I'm now waiting for Villain to table his hand. He does eventually table his hand for Jack 10 offsuit for a flop top pair, which is no good as we have him outkicked with the ace. So I then table my hand, and we now get to drag in a nice decent pot to rebuild our stack. In this next hand, the action folds to me in early position, and I look down at pocket aces. I decide to make the standard open to $15. The action folds to a middle position player who makes the call and continues folding to the small blind who calls, and the big blind also calls. So we are now going 4 ways to the flop, which comes 8, Jack, Jack, rainbow. The action quickly checks to me, and in this spot, I think we can mix between checking and betting here. I think the more players there are in this hand, I think the more often we would be checking rather than betting. And in this hand, given that we are 4 ways to the flop, I did lean more towards checking here. So that's what I decided to do. I decided also to play a check, and the action is now on the middle position player who doesn't check, and instead he decides to put out a small bet of $35. The small blind calls, the big blind folds and the action's on me. And in this spot, I don't think it makes too much sense raising here, as I think it's going to be quite tough to get hands worse than ours to continue. So for that reason, I think I want to just continue with the call here and keep in all the AX and pocket pairs that either of our opponents could easily have in this hand, which we have beat to continue extracting value. So with this in mind, I decided to continue with just a flat call. We are now off to a turn card, and on the turn, the dealer puts out an offsuit 10. The small blind checks twice, and I also decide to play a check. The action's on the middle position player, who does decide to continue betting, although he decides to continue betting for a very small amount of just $40. The small blind decides to fold, and the action's now on me. I think with this bet sizing, Villain is trying to tell me that he has a hand better than an 8x. I would expect Villain to be checking here, especially seeing 2 calls ahead of him if he had a hand like 8-7 or 8-9 suited. I think when Villain does decide to continue double barreling, I think the worst hand he should have is a hand like pocket 9s. So versus this range, which we do have crushed, as we only lose to Jack X and straights, which given that Villain has decided to bet small again, I highly doubt that Villain would have any of these hands. But still, I don't think I like raising here, as our hand doesn't really need much protection. I do think I have the best hand here pretty much all the time. I like continue just calling here to underwrap our hand and give ourselves an easy check call type decision on the river if Villain decides to value bet for a third time with a weaker 2 pair. So with this in mind, I decided to continue with a flat call. So we are now off to the river card, and on the river the dealer puts out a 3 of spades, which is a complete brick. I decide to check for a third time, looking to play a check call, and Villain, after taking just a little bit of time, does decide to put out another bet. He decides to bet $85. In this spot, I think we have a no-brainer check call here, so that's what I decide to do. I decide to flick in the call, and Villain tables pocket 10s for a turned full house. Given that we never really showed much strength in this hand, I think Villain sized down his bets accordingly, and therefore we were able to lose a smaller pot than we could have.
Don't got hurt? No, of course not.
In this next hand, the $10 straddle is on, and the action folds all the way to me in the small blind. And I look down at ace king of clubs, so I decide to put in a raise to $40. The big blind folds, and the action's on the straddler, who looks at his cards before deciding to flick in the call. The Villain in the straddle position starts the hand with about $900, and we cover. We are now going heads up to the flop, which comes 3-5-7 with 2 clubs. So a pretty decent flop for our hand. Now in this spot, with a hand as strong as 2 overcards and the nut flush draw, we definitely want to be building the pot here. So on the face of it, I guess we got 2 options here. We can either bet or we can check raise. But given that we're seeing 3 small cards here, I don't think check raising would make too much sense here, as more likely than not, we're going to be having big cards rather than little cards in this scenario. Neither player in this hand should really connect with this flop all too often. So I think what that means is that more often than not, I think our ace high should be the best hand very often here. So with all of that considered, I decided to continue for a small C bet of $30. Villain then doesn't think for too long before making the call. So we are now off to the turn card, and on the turn the dealer puts out an offsuit 6, which does now put 4 to a straight out on the board. The action's on me, and in this spot I've ranged my opponent on 1 pair type hands and flush draws. I don't think Villain has a 4 in his hand too often here. If I felt I was good on the flop, I think I am still good on the turn, and therefore I want to continue betting. However, I don't think we want to bet too big here. I think I want to continue extracting value versus flush draws, and I think if Villain did have us beat with a hand like 2 pair or a set, then I think these hands will be calling regardless of the bet sizing that we choose, and which therefore I think we would prefer to choose smaller rather than larger bet sizings. I decide to continue betting for $50. Villain now decides to go into the tank to consider his options, and when he's taking this amount of time to go into the tank, I'm re-evaluating the kind of hands that Villain has in this spot, as I think if Villain did have just like a naked flush draw, I think he probably would have called more quickly. Therefore, I think Villain is now deciding whether or not he wants to raise. So now I'm wondering if Villain really does have a straight or a set in his hand, and while all of this is going through my head, Villain does decide to put out a raise to $175. In this part, of course, we are never folding here, so I'm just trying to decide now whether we want to jam or just call. My read on Villain in this hand is that he has a flush draw, and I'm just wondering if he actually has the 4 of clubs in his hand, so he's got a straight with a flush draw, and if that was the case, then of course we would never want to be jamming in this case, and we would just always want to be calling. And I think for the type of hands that I'm putting Villain on right now, I think all of them would be snap calling my jam on the turn here. So for this reason, I don't think I want to be jamming, and I think I just want to continue calling here and look to improve on the river. So that's what I decided to do. I decided to continue with a flat call. We are now off to the river card, and on the river, the dealer puts out the 8 of clubs. So we managed to river the nuts. Villain has about $800 or $900 left in the stack. Villain has an SPR or a stack to pot ratio of about 2 to 1. If we want to get all the money in, I think 2 bets needs to come in on the river here. I think if we bet, I think it's very unlikely we're going to get raised, especially given that we have the ace of clubs. So I think the best way to get all the money in here is to play a check raise. I'm putting villain on a flush here, so I'm not really expecting, or at least I should say I'm really hoping that villain doesn't check back if I do decide to check here. So that's what I decided to do. I decided to play a very sneaky check, and after taking a little bit of time, villain, fortunately for me, decides to bet $260. This is like the perfect amount for me, because not only is it very easy for me to get all the money in, I think with the size of this bet, I think shows quite a lot of strength that villain more likely than not has a flush here. The action's on me, and of course we have a no-brainer jam here. So after taking maybe like 20 seconds or so, I decided to jam for the rest of villain's stack here. And now villain is now back in the tank, and he is now very pained with his decision. Villain actually takes quite a lot of time here. I think he must have been in the tank for like at least a couple of minutes, and after taking quite a bit of time, villain eventually decides to make the call. So I show my hand, and villain sees the bad news before then quietly mucking his cards. So we now get to drag in a huge pot here thanks to a very lucky river card. So in this next hand, there is a limp from under the gun. And then I am then next to act, and I look down at King Queen offsuit. So I decide to raise to $20. There is a call from middle position, late position, and the big blind, and the under the gun also decides to call. So we are now going 5 ways to the flop, which comes King 10-8 rainbow. The big blind decides to check, which is pretty standard. However, the under the gun player decides to put out a bet. He decides to bet $40. For me, this seems a bit strange, given that I'm the pre-flop aggressor, and more often than not, it should pretty much always be checked to me. My read on the player from under the gun is that he more likely than not has flopped top pair or has some kind of a draw. I'm not very keen on just calling here and giving a really good price for the players behind me to come along and see a cheap turn card. So for this reason, I think I like raising. I don't think we need to go for a large sizing here, as I don't want to polarize my range to sets and draws. So for that reason, I decided to put in a small raise of $105. The middle position folds, late position folds, and the action is now on the big blind. And after taking a little bit of time to decide what to do, the big blind decides to cold call my raise here on the flop. I think when the big blind decides to do this, I think it should be very unlikely that he has a top pair type hand. And I think this is because of 2 reasons. The first reason is because I have a king and I'm putting the under the gun player on a king. And secondly, and also arguably more importantly, I think if villain does continue versus a raise on the flop, he's most likely to only really have a big draw or a set, as I think pretty much all 1 pair type hands should be folding here. So when big blind calls, I think more likely than not he has a draw like Jack 9 or 9-7 suited. The action is now back on the under the gun player, who goes into the tank before eventually deciding to come along for a call. So we are now going 3 ways to the turn card, and on the turn the dealer puts out the 5 of spades, which now brings in the backdoor flush draw. The big blind checks, the under the gun player checks, and I think on this turn card, which I perceive to be pretty much a brick, I think we want to continue barreling here. So I decided to put out another bet of $150. And after just taking a little bit of time, the big blind decides to continue with a call. And after seeing this much action in front of him, the under the gun player decides to fold. So we are now going heads up to the river card. The dealer puts out the ace of diamonds. Villain now decides to take some time to go deep into the tank. And after giving it some thought, villain decides to fire out at this river for $400. Now, in my mind, of course, given that this river card does complete some queen jack, given that we do have a queen on our hand, does make it less likely. I don't think I lose to any 2 pairs here. As from my read on the flop, I was putting villain squarely on a draw. I don't think I'm losing to a hand like ace 10 or ace 8, as these hands would have folded on the flop. So in my mind, villain only really has 9-7, jack 9, queen jack is quite unlikely. So therefore, in my mind, this ace was a brick. After seeing the $400 bet, I pretty much snap called, and then villain tabled queen 9 of clubs for a busted draw. I then table my hand for the winner and get to drag in this nice, decent pot. Nice one.
You were to win.
I thought you had Jack 9 to be fair.
Huh?
I thought you had Jack 9 to be fair. Right, and now we come on to the final interesting hand from my jam-packed session last Friday. In this hand, there is a limp from early position. The action then folds to the cutoff, who also decides to limp in, and then I look down on the button with King Jack of Hearts. So I decide to put in a raise to $25. The small blind calls, the big blind calls, and both the early position and cutoff limpers also decide to call. We are now going 5 ways to the flop, which comes King 5-4 with 2 spades and 1 heart. The action checks to me, and in this spot, we can go either way with this hand between checking and betting. Given that there are 2 small connected cards and also a flush draw that's not our suits, I'm leaning more towards checking here rather than betting, especially as we are up against 4 opponents and our hand doesn't really perform particularly well versus check raises. And also given that we do have a backdoor flush draw, I think I'd rather pot control here and see if we can pick up additional equity on the turn before committing more chips, as I think in that scenario, I think it would be a lot easier to continue versus check raises. So after considering the above, I decide to check back. So we are now off to the turn card, and on the turn, the dealer puts out the 10 of hearts, which now brings in the backdoor flush draw for us. The action then again quickly checks all the way to me. And in this spot, given that we now have improved to a flush draw to go along with our top pair, I now decide to put out a delay c-bet of $50. The small blind folds, and the action is now on the big blind, who goes into the tank. And after thinking about what he wants to do, he eventually decides to put in a raise to $200. The early position and cutoff quickly fold, and the action is now back on me. Given that I'm seeing now a check raise, it's definitely a lot easier for us to continue. To be honest, I don't think our hand is good very often here versus check raises, so I think more often than not we would need some help on the river card. I think we have a no-brainer decision here. Don't like raising, certainly don't like folding, so I decide to commit the chips for a call. So we're now going heads up to the river card, and on the river, the dealer puts out the 7 of hearts. So we now manage to complete our backdoor flush. The action's on the big blind, who goes into the tank, and after a little while, he eventually decides to check. So the action's now on me, and of course, we're going to be putting in a bet here. Now, I think in this spot, I think we want to go reasonably polar here. And I think the reason is because all of our 1 pair type hands would want to be checking back here. So we don't really have any medium strength hands here. We only really arrive at the river here with missed spades or rivered flushes. So essentially we only have flushes or complete air. So because of this, we want to be choosing large bet sizings here. And the type of hands that we would be targeting for a call here would be inferior flushes and 2 pair plus type hands like 5-4 suited or sets. So after taking a little bit of time to decide on bet sizings, I eventually decide to put out a bet of $400. Villain now goes deep into the tank, and he is really struggling with his decision. He's not really sure what to do. He starts talking to me and he's asking me if I've flopped like a set of kings. I'm just still as a rock, not giving any responses. And after a couple of minutes or so, Villain decides to make the good fold, and he actually shows me that he had flopped a set of 4s. Great fold by Villain, nice hand, and we are going to be dragging in this last pot of our session. Right, so that concludes all the interesting hands from our session last Friday. So as you could probably guess from the session and from our chip stack, we did pretty well. We managed to end the session up $2,624. And as a summary for the week, we managed to end the week up $4,624. Take care guys, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.